Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On this week's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology, we take a look at one of the most difficult books I own. Difficult is the only way I know how to describe this book because it's not only almost impossible to read without reading Carl Jung's work, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, which is an already sufficiently difficult text, but the density of the work in and of itself is enough to make you stop reading after a few paragraphs, scratch your head, and ask yourself, what the did I just read? The Origins and History of Consciousness by Eric Newman is his magnum opus, and for good reason. To simply describe the general thesis of the book isn't exactly difficult, but it would be like giving you the definition of what an encyclopedia is without diving into what's inside. It is not hyperbole to say that within this small 450-page book lies the entire world history of archetypal consciousness. In fact, that was Newman's goal when writing it. Jung wrote the foreword to this book in 1949, towards the end of his career and life, and reflected on the monumental nature of the work when he wrote, "It begins where I too would begin, if I were granted a second lease on life. This difficult and meteorous task the author has performed with outstanding success. He has woven his facts into a pattern and created a unified whole, which no pioneer could have done, nor could have ever attempted to do." Those words are important. His facts. As often as the introvert has to ask himself whether his facts represent the objective facts of reality, we must question whether or not this book is simply an attempt to make the theory of analytical psychology explain the psychological development of humanity throughout history. This is a valid question because there's no shortage of examples of people who have attempted to explain reality using their own, usually non-scientific theories. Classical psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on sexuality and libido, is just one example. However, to Freud and everyone else's credit, no one has ever really attempted to explain the entire unfolding of cultural and human consciousness according to the psychosexual stages of development. Freud mostly stayed within his own time period and described the psychology of his age. Jung was a pioneer, to use his own words, who chose to venture further into the past in an attempt to discover the primeval beginnings of the unconscious psyche. So, to answer the question, is this work another example of a man trying to make the facts of reality conform to his theory? Here is where I would be inclined to say, yes, surely, if it weren't for the sheer volume of material, density, and thoroughness of the research provided. Newman's knowledge of human culture, spanning as far back as humanly possible, even eclipses Jung's. What lies within the pages of this book is nothing short of a lifetime of learning, so forgive me because this video will absolutely not do justice to the information that's contained within these pages. If you are the type of person who's up for the challenge, and you've read Jung or are reading Jung, then I'd encourage you to check out this book for a deeper understanding of human culture and its psychological development. For the purposes of this series, I'm only concerned with how we can apply the knowledge within this book to the practice of psychotherapy itself. And with that being said, let's dive into the origins and history of consciousness. We'll begin with a quote from the opening chapter, which helps us establish not only the theme of the book, but the context in which humanity began, and similarly, the context from which most psychotherapy begins, in a state of relative unconsciousness. Newman writes, "Fixation in the unconscious, the downward drag of its specific gravity, cannot be called the desire to remain unconscious. On the contrary, that is the natural thing. There is a counteracting force, the desire to become conscious, a veritable instinct impelling man in this direction. One has no need to desire to remain unconscious. One is primarily unconscious and can at most conquer the original situation in which man drowses in the world, drowses in the unconscious, contained in the infinite, like a fish in the environing sea." The idea here is that, especially in the context of psychotherapy, human beings begin as unconscious beings. Stretching as far back as time affords us, humans have struggled against the psychic state of not knowing. Humanity has fought hard against the forces of nature to achieve even our limited understanding. Even to this day, we remain mostly unconscious. So too do our patients as they enter psychotherapy for the first time. Some of them have no idea what's wrong with them, with their health, or with their lives. Some prefer to remain unconscious because there's bliss in ignorance. But most, if not all, people engaging in psychotherapy want to know. They desire to become conscious. So, how can the practice of psychotherapy help illuminate the way forward for those of us wandering in darkness? Going back to last week's episode on the psychological types, Newman provides us with the proverbial torch to light the way, helping us orient ourselves and see that there are 3 distinct paths. Which path we choose is largely dependent upon ours and our patient's psychological type. He writes, "The aim of the extroverted type of hero is action. He is the founder, leader, and liberator whose deeds change the face of the world. The introverted type is the culture bringer, the redeemer and the savior who discovers the inner values, exalting them as knowledge and wisdom, as a law and a faith, a work to be accomplished and an example to be followed. The creative act of raising the buried treasure is common to both types of hero, and the prerequisite for this is union with the liberative captive, who is as much the mother of the creative act as the hero is its father. The third type of hero does not seek to change the world through his struggle with the inside or outside, but to transform his personality. Self-transformation is his true aim, and the liberating effect this has upon the world is only secondary. His self-transformation may be held up as a human ideal, but his consciousness is not directed in the narrower sense towards the collective. For in him, centroversion expresses the natural and fundamental trend of the human psyche, which is operative from the very beginning and which forms the basis of not only self-preservation, but of self-formation as well. Centroversion, as Newman calls it, is the psychological disposition that one achieves through the process of individuation, the effective middle point between extreme introversion and extreme extroversion. Clinically, centroversion describes a mentally healthy attitude that is not immune to psychological struggle, but is flexible enough to effectively meet the psychological task of our daily, personal, and existential difficulties. Extreme introversion might manifest clinically as paranoid psychosis or schizoid or avoidant personality, whereas extreme extroversion is primarily seen in borderline, histrionic, and hyper-dependent personality states. The goal for psychotherapy with either extremely extroverted or extremely introverted people is to help bring them closer to the middle, to achieve a balanced psychological state that allows them the flexibility to approach problems from a different perspective, a less one-sided approach to effectively solving or sometimes just coping with their problems. This finding of the center, this change, is the self-transformation that Newman talks about, and its acquisition is facilitated in psychotherapy, but ultimately, it is the archetypal human process of attaining psychic equilibrium. That is the eternal motif that is embodied in life itself, the human struggle to comprehend and understand the unknown and unknowable. The attainment of centroversion, the myth of the philosophic gold that is not common gold, and the hero's fight with the dragon are all symbolic representations of the archetypal struggle of consciousness with unconsciousness. This struggle is, at bottom, the universal struggle that unites all humanity. Newman writes, "We began with the ego in the womb of the parental Ouroboros dragon, curled up like an embryo in the sheltering fusion of inside and outside, world and unconscious. We end, as in an alchemical picture, with the hermaphrodite standing upon the dragon. By virtue of its own synthetic being, it has overcome the primal situation. Above it hangs down the crown of the self, and in its heart glows the diamond. But only when the conscious development of mankind as a whole, and not merely of single individuals, has reached this state of synthesis, will the supra-individual Ouroboros situation truly be overcome, and with it the collective danger of the dragon. The collective unconscious of mankind must be experienced and apprehended by the consciousness of mankind as the common ground to all men. Not until this differentiation of races into nations, tribes, and groups has, by process of psychic integration, been resolved into a new synthesis, will danger of recurrent invasions from the unconscious be averted. A humanity will then realize the center, which the individual personality today experiences as his own self-center, to be one with humanity's very self, whose coming to birth will finally vanquish and cast out that old serpent, the primordial Ouroboric dragon." And if that is not an example of the difficulty of this book, I don't know what is. So that concludes this week's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? I would like to again encourage the ambitious reader of Jung to take on this book when they have the time. It is undoubtedly one of the most important texts in analytical psychology, and if Jung describes in detail the symbolic process of transformation within the individual, Newman describes the symbolic transformation of history and culture in equal measure. I hope this shorter video was a bit easier to digest and engage with. Next week, we'll follow the theme of mythology, and we will take a look at Rollo May's A Cry for Myth. I hope you tune in and enjoy. Until next time, thank you.